I took the title of this particular session very literally in terms of socioeconomic aggregates, and I think I will take a very, very aggregate view, very macro, much more macro than anything probably that we will hear. Maybe in a way that's the job of the macroeconomists, is to ask the questions, and then the microeconomists and the biologists and the anthropologists will answer them maybe. So, so this is about the role of ancestry and especially the diffusion of important economic outcomes at the societal levels, as especially economic development. And what I would like to do is to mention a few facts, so a few empirical relations. They are mostly correlations or partial correlations that come from regressions between the ancestral compositions of current populations and aggregate socioeconomic outcomes, in particular economic development, but also we've done some work on the adoption of technological innovations, although I will not talk specifically about that. Then I will raise some questions. Why does ancestry matter, and possible mechanisms, which I think is in the spirit of this meeting. And I will, if I have time, I will try to go over the example of the spread of the industrial evolution and the decline of marital fertility in Europe, especially in the 19th century and 20th century, and talk whether this could be described as a tale of two diffusions. So this is based on work that I did with Roman Baxterz at UCLA, and we've been doing an article in the QJE, and in particular, if you're interested in this sort of economic historian or macro view, we have a paper in the Journal of Economic Literature, How Deep Are the Roots of Economic Development, and also a chapter in a Handbook of Economic Growth. So we sort of know, I think now, at least if you look at this data, that long-term persistence tends to hold at the level of populations rather than locations. So that if you focus on populations rather than locations, you'll see that there is a persistent in technological levels, not necessarily in income per capita, because for a long time populations were in a Malthusian world, but certainly the population density that measures productivity. And this might shed light on the spread of economic development. Now, so if current economic development is correlated with the historical characteristics of a population's ancestors, the question is why. We know that, take this regression, for example, that we have in our JEL paper. So you try to look at income per capita in 2005 across countries, and you put there variables that are related to the ancestors of the population that live in the country now. For example, the share of descendants of Europeans, ancestry-adjusted years of agriculture. So how much experience in agriculture had, not in the location, but the ancestors of the populations who are in the location, ancestry-adjusted state history. These are variables that have been proposed by Patterman and Weil in a recent QGA paper. We also look at the FST genetic distance of the ancestral populations. And I will talk more about this. And you find pretty strong correlations there. So now, but the question, of course, is what are the mechanisms there? How do we interpret this? Is there what is the causality? Is this the importance of inheritance systems? Is it biological? Is it cultural? Is the interaction between gene and cultures? And also, there is another dimension that I would like to stress because I think it's less stressed, I think, in the literature, the difference between having direct effects from inherited traits from your ancestors, let's say something that you inherit that makes you more productive or more likely to adopt an innovation, and what I would call barrier effects. And let me be more specific here. So this is a general taxonomy of how inherited traits might have an effect on economic outcomes, especially at the societal level, whether you're more likely to adopt an innovation, to have a high income per capita. Now, a lot of the emphasis has been on these direct effects. Some people have stressed this biological, genetic, and now we hear just a more trendy epigenetic, but certainly biological transmission. And this is especially work by economists. I mean, Clark has been mentioned here. Galore has done a lot of work on this. So there is the cultural part, and of course I second that it would be nicer to have a more a testable model of cultural transmission. I think there has been progress in economics. Bizine and Verdier have models of cultural transmission that in principle are testable, but certainly that's a big challenge. How do we and the interaction between gene and culture. And now economists have been working on lactose intolerance, the lactose tolerance, the spread, and how that has interacted with cultural the transmission of cultural innovation. So now, However, these direct effects are not the only part of the story. In fact, I would say that for something as big as the spread of the Industrial Revolution, or for something as big as this big change in behavior that happens pretty rapidly, this decline in marital fertility in Europe, the fact that you marry and then you have just a couple of kids, and then you shut the factory. That's a very novel behavior. People used to control fertility by maybe postponing marriage, maybe, but not necessarily by having this new model of having small families. So these kind of behavioral changes that spread over, let's say, Europe and then the rest of the world pretty rapidly, and eventually everybody, almost every society got it, but at different times. That's probably a lot to do with diffusion, but this diffusion is probably something that has to do with these vertically transmitted traits. If you have got different traits from your ancestors for thousands of years and you diverge and you are more or less closer to the frontier, you're more or less likely to adopt these innovations. And that's something that I think could be studied more. Now, our own work on FST genetic distance shows that there is a correlation between genetic distance to the USA. Of course, by the USA, you could do it, well, to the population, to the Amerindian population in the USA. Of course, that doesn't matter as much to the populations, to the genetic distance that you would expect when you look at the populations that currently live in the USA, for the English mostly, but also others. So now we find these correlations, but how do we interpret them? Why would, of course, FST is a measure of selectively neutral genes. It doesn't mean an evidence of genetic effects per se, but they point to the importance of intergenerationally transmitted traits as a possible mechanism through which something happened that now is affecting level of economic development. Now, if you look at the diffusion of the Industrial Revolution over different points in time, so income in 1820, how much of that is correlated to FST genetic distance to the English across countries? Income in 1870, 1913, 1960, 2005. Let's look at the standardized beta as a sense of how important this genetic distance is. And you get a pattern like this. So at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, genetic distance to the English mattered, but not as much. It peaked around the late 19th century, and then it went down. That sounds to me like a process of diffusion. I mean, at the beginning, it's more likely that only the English had the Industrial Revolution and had higher income per capita. And then as the Industrial Revolution spread over time, first it spread to populations that were much closer, because in a sort of historical sense, intergenerational transmitted traits, all sorts of things that might be captured by this, and that's a big question. And then as the Industrial Revolution spread further, this distance to the English matter less. Now, here is marital fertility. Now, here is interesting because marital fertility has a different source, a different frontier, a different innovator, potentially, possibly. Fertility decline is, as I mentioned, especially within marriage, is much a new, more novel behavior and involves some sort of cultural changes in the way that we approach marriage. I mean, things that you do with your spouse that maybe before were not considered fine, a change in values. There is a famous study by the Princeton European Fertility Project, and so we know that the fertility transition, especially for marital fertility in selected European populations, has varied a lot historically, from France being the frontier and England being much later, getting much later, only at the end of the 1892 for England, but France 1827. And you see Walloon Belgium, the French-speaking part of Belgium, getting the fertility transition way before Flemish Belgium, in fact, 30 years before. So here is a possible sort of test of whether there are different diffusions of this new behavior, modernity. We could say the Industrial Revolution with all this technological innovation, but also different behavioral changes. This is Europe with different transition dates, starting for fertility, for marital fertility, starting in France and and then spreading to other parts of Europe. So you can do this at the regional level. You can do it at the national level, but much better to do it at the regional level, so you can control for country fixed effects and things like that. And so the question is, what are the facts, at least? What are the correlations here, at least? So is it a tale of two diffusion? This is a question. This is an open question. Is it possible that the spread of modernity involved two, maybe more, separate processes of diffusion, the spread of the technological innovations from England, but there are social behavioral changes where France was the leader, maybe because of the Enlightenment, because maybe of the French Revolution, the effects of the French Revolution, maybe of reasons like that. And this diffusion, were the barriers to the diffusion dependent on these sort of ancestral characteristics? Is it sort of, this is horizontal diffusion, what anthropologists would call horizontal diffusion of behavior, but the barriers of what is the region or what is the group that is more likely to adopt the new behavior might depend on how closer or farther you are along these vertical traits that were transmitted for a long time that makes you more or less like to say, oh, now the French have this great idea of having less kids, we should do the same. Or the English have this new way of organizing production, we could try to imitate them. So these are the French according to genetic distance from Cavalli, Sforza, and co-authors. Of course, they are close to the English, but not that close. I mean, so you can certainly disentangle the French from the English. They are geographically pretty close as well. But so if you just look at the regression of genetic distance from France to understand the transition date for marital fertility, you find, not surprisingly, given the graph that I showed, the map that I showed before, you find a pretty strong correlation, controlling, of course, for all sorts of distances, geographic distance, latitude, microgeography, rivers, average elevations, etc., all the other things that might confuse the sort of the correlation. And then this is controlling for geographical distance, the genetic distance to France and the fertility transition. But this is at the national level, so of course not many data, there are only 30 data for Europe. You can do a horse race then with England, and you see that France beats England in terms of being a much better predictor, distance to France being a much better predictor of distance from England in terms of whether you would get to the fertility transition earlier rather than later, again, controlling for geography. Interestingly, the geographical distance doesn't seem to matter as much. It's the genetic distance. Then you can say, well, can we go at the regional level? We don't have very good data genetically for different regions. You have 700, 100 regions of Europe because we are relying on Cavalli Sforza still for this. Of course, one could do, I guess, more with the more recent data. So we look at the linguistic distance, but linguistic distance of the ancestral languages, the dialects, rather than the national languages. So Français, I should really have said Francienne, because that's really the langue d'Oil of Paris. And how it's closer to Castilian, and you go and count the notes, which is imperfect, but at least it's something that has a sort of a sort of similar to a tree, and so it tells us how closely related these different populations are in terms of the closely related the languages that they ancestrally they spoke, and so this is a map of different dialects of Europe. So you can go a little bit deeper into who is closer to who in terms of these ancestral dialects. It's a proxy for intergenerationally transmitted traits, maybe, and you find again a very strong correlation with being closer to Francais in terms of getting the fertility transition, and you also find again that if you put a horse race between to be close to English and close to Francais, it's really closer to Francais that seems to matter more. Now, so this seems to show that fertility behavior and the diffusion of economic development also follow different patterns, which is consistent with what sociologists and anthropologists try to tell us that we shouldn't really think that there is such a close effect necessarily of things like income or human capital right away, but certainly they interact with each other in complex ways. What I will hope to do is that if we bring some, of course, if we were to go at the micro level, if we were to look at what are the mechanisms, is it, and especially how traits that are transmitted intergenerationally affect not only directly the traits that then future generations have, but how they interact with each other. So the social interactions across society and how they imitate each other. Maybe we can get some insights on these macro phenomena. In this particular case, it seems to me that, at least as a first approximation, the spread of lower marital fertility seems to come much more from France than from England, and maybe this is just a proxy for all sorts of other modern secular behaviors, while the English, that were much at the frontier technologically, they were not necessarily doing the same. They were not, in fact, I even read that people that started to have smaller families in England were immigrants from France. So this is the kind of But the big open question is still about the specific mechanism. These are obviously just across country or cross-regional regressions. So they tell us something about the patterns. They can tell us a little bit, maybe suggest a little bit about the mechanism, but in order to get to the mechanism, of course, we would need to have a much more micro-founded sort of study in there. So these are the kind of, so this is much more in terms of questions to the audience than in terms of answers at the moment. Thanks. Yes.
You were going through the tables fast, maybe I missed it.
Yeah, no, sorry.
Did you put the linguistic distance in directly against the genetic distance?
No, I couldn't do that, unfortunately, well, I could do it at the national level, but it would probably be, they would be very, I don't know how informative, because for genetic distance, we have 30 observations for 30 populations in Europe. For linguistic distance, we have 700 observations because we go regional. And we could try to see what happens, I suppose, controlling for the genetic distance of the nation. But of course, it's not going to be a very perfect test. I cannot do it at the regional level. But that would be a very interesting question, absolutely.
I was wondering, first of all, how correlated, they look pretty correlated.
Well, they are language and genetic distance. We look at it in the QGE. We did talk a lot about that because there we had a horse race between linguistic distance and genetic distance with respect to income differences and development in the world. And genetic distance wins hands down. I mean, it's genetic distance, not language. Language gets, reduces the effect of genetic distance by 10% if you control for linguistic distance. The correlation is high, but it's not as high as one would think. It's maybe 0.6. Now, we know from Cavalli-Sforza that ancestral languages are very highly correlated to genetic distance, but there are a lot of populations that speak English or Spanish or Portuguese that are very different genetically from each other, and also there are also the Magyars, the Turks, so there were small minorities. They came in and they spread their language, but genetically the Hungarians are closer to the Poles than they are to the Altaic population. So in that sense, it seems that if you had genetic distance, it would be a better proxy. So if you take that interpretation, this ancestral language might just proxy also for all sorts of other traits that you are transmitted historically over time. So I wouldn't take this as a test, genes versus culture. That would be silly because, of course, it's also possible that the effect of FST is capturing culturally transmitted traits, obviously. So we cannot tell that at the macro level. Yeah. Yes.
I suspect you could get something with finer grain genetics information about Europe fairly easily today. I can't think of a perfect source instantly. But
blood. I mean, we look at blood. There is a lot about blood. I mean, we can look. We can measure by.
Look for SNP measurements. It's probably out there.
At the region.
You can get finer grained FST.
Yeah.
For regions of Europe, for regions for specific
The other thing is, Quebec doesn't fit into this.
Yes.
Yeah, Quebec had that transition, that fertility transition, the 1960s?
Much later. I gave a talk about this in Quebec, in fact, at the Université de Montréal, and we were talking exactly about this. Now, that's very interesting because it could point out that maybe what really happened in France was the loss of power of the Catholic Church and the tradition. And in Quebec, because the Catholic Church was all they had, the French-speaking people, that was much more powerful. So it's possible that the original, the cultural aspects that one is picking up, that the spread might have something to do specifically with the French Revolution.
Well, there's another thing, Quebec. I mean, Quebec, during most of this period, was a place where there was a lot of unoccupied, potentially farmable land. And so if people were being constrained by saying, will there be room for my kids? For a long period, they could say, sure. But in France, that was never true.
Right.
So economics.
So you're telling me that I should look at economic variables.
Well, that too.
I'm delighted to hear that from you.
Why not?
Yeah. So, yes.
One remark and a small question. The remark is that in the period you are considering, both the French government and the Dutch government, the German government, did dedicated effort to increase the birth rate.
Later. I'm considering the transition. The French were very concerned about this because that's why they think they lost the war in 1870 and almost lost in 1914. So, so they were certainly very concerned. So later, they had pronatalist policies. And these days, in fact, the lower marital fertility is in the south of Italy, it's not in France. So this thing spread everywhere, and eventually in some countries they went back in terms of marital fertility, partly as an endogenous policy response, partly for other reasons. What I'm focusing here is the transition, which is defined by this Princeton fertility study, as I'm out of time, so I will just say, is defined by the Princeton fertility study as the time at which really there is a sort of discrete big drop in the number of kids, and then you reach a new steady state. But then there is fluctuation around that steady state. But what is interesting here is the diffusion process. Eventually, you get some regions, Sardinia that got it in 1960s. Now they have lower marital fertility probably than Paris, I suspect. But, yes.
And a quick question. Finnish and Hungarian, they are completely different linguistically. They both differ linguistically from the rest quite substantially.
Yes.
And they resemble each other. Do you find that back in your data?
Well, I suppose that the linguistic distance might be capturing this. Although Hungary is kind of special because there was an area of Hungary that started the fertility transition very, very early, almost as early as France. So in that sense, they seem to be outliers. But probably this whole thing is not it's swamped in the big amount of data. But so I don't know. I don't know what I would what would be the story there between the relation between. It's possible that you could have a different small frontier that spreads and maybe locally, and there's nothing that said that everything has to come from France. And also things might go to Germany, and then you learn from the Germans if you're close to the Germans, so that the spread can take different perspectives.